would you like to say a few
Yeah,
things
sure.
about the show?
Thank you, Talley, so much. I'm kind of sort of vibrating because Texas is so important to me, and there's so many people in here that are. Not that New Orleans isn't important to me. It's where I was. my father would say I turned my back on the city, but I call him every day, so that's not too far. But I can't thank Talley and Courtney and Meredith and Trini, and there's a gentleman here from Nebraska named John Love who this wouldn't exist without, and a man that's not here but is here in spirit named Walker Pickering, who helps me with the photographs that you see in the exhibition. So I guess I should start here. This is mostly what I do. I spend a lot of time researching things, looking at things, looking at other people's things, and so the ideas they kind of start off. I usually make really small things. I like the intimacy of small things, and I'm not very good on social media because I write really long emails, and if somebody contacts me, I feel compelled to write a long email, and so that doesn't really work well on Instagram, and so so my wife Myra keeps me off of that. So I had this show. I've done this piece a couple of times. The first time I did it was in Des Moines, Iowa at Drake University, and it was this enormous room. And I thought, there's just no way. There's no way.
Will you tell them what it is?
Oh, I will. Yes. It's 4 years of bookmarks. It's 4 years of my bookmarks for the first 4 years I lived in Nebraska. And so it was this big room. I had nothing, I had no ideas. And I was just researching stuff as I do. And I thought, I wonder what it would be like if I just took everything I bookmarked and had it printed on vinyl and put it on this wall. But not just on the wall, but wrapped it over the windows and around corners. So I contacted this wonderful, was a student and then ex-student and got his master's, John Love, and he helped me put this together. But I didn't realize this, but this is pretty typical how I work. I sort of I cut and pasted all of these into Word, and then clicked on all of them to see that they all worked. And I probably could have just selected them all. I just didn't realize that. I'm not real tech savvy. So anyway, and it looks different wherever it's installed. It looks very different. So it was installed earlier in the year, a version of it, and it was a little bit fatter and a little bit just not as long and wide. Or wider, not as long. So every time I see it, it's a really interesting experience to know how it's going to turn out. I have a sort of idea, but when I come back to it, it's like Old Home Week. I sort of look at all these links and think, oh, God, I remember when I looked at that, or I bet that doesn't even work any longer, or I hope nobody sees that, and mostly what I like to do, I like to talk, so my work involves talking about things. So earlier on, some earlier pieces back there, earlier this year, there's a gentleman named Ed Blackburn, who's an artist that lives in Fort Worth, and Ed and I ate dinner for 4 years straight every Wednesday, and I would have these incredibly intense conversations with him, and they were some of the most important conversations I've ever had. And when I left Texas, I couldn't have these conversations, or at least not the same way. So I made up these two characters, and one looks like an M and one looks like a W. And the W is called the weigher, or I call him the weigher, and he only asks questions. And the miner, has to look for him. It's basically the two sides of my name talking to one another. And so I started out the year kind of working with those, and it was like I would have these conversations on the page. That's the work I was doing for probably the last 5 years, maybe longer, maybe 9. And then I did this residency, and for some reason, I thought, okay, well, I'm in Mexico, and I should probably try something different. Like, you know, they asked me to come here, so I said, well, maybe I'll just ditch these 2 characters for a while, and I'll just try to write. And so the first thing that came up was like my as I close in on my half century, my gift to myself is to have tinnitus. So I have tinnitus in my left ear. So I constantly have this like this. It sounds like well, it sounds different. If it's an air conditioner near me, it sounds like wind chimes, and which sounds wonderful, but it's not. It's like not. And then sometimes it just sounds like static. And so I use so as a kind of visual metaphor for that, I use television snow, which it sort of reminds me of. So you'll see that kind of repeated in different images. I also saw. I don't know why it took me so long to figure this out, but I saw this Jasper Johns show at MoMA called Jasper Johns Regrets, and it just occurred to me, it's like, oh yeah, you know, he uses the same image a lot and just kind of plays with it over and over again. I'm like, why am I doing that? Why don't I try something that I use the same image throughout a sequence of pieces? So this piece behind, it's a 4-part piece, and I became, one of the links on here is a link to a movie called The Dodge House 1916. And the Dodge House was this house in California made by an architect named Irving Gill. And it was slotted for destruction. And there was this woman named Esther McCoy who made a film to try to save the house. And I can't remember how or why I landed on this link, but I watched this film and I was listening to the narrator, and I was so moved by what the pacing and what he had to say that I was like, who the hell made this film? And I found out this woman, Esther McCoy, made it. And she was a very important writer on architecture in California. She was a real champion of California architecture. And so I wanted to do a piece about her. So I started writing a lot and thinking, like, how am I going to talk about this person's writing and how beautiful it is? And I realized, like, well, maybe I should just take passages from various pieces of hers and thread them together into a kind of strange narrative. And so all the writing in this is out of sequence, and none of the names of the architects are mentioned, but it's all her words. It's like a cut and paste sort of thing. And then I was a little worried that I was going to call the person that wrote this compendium on Esther McCoy, and people were like, you know, you do that, and like that piece is going to be, she's going to, you know, send a lawyer to Lincoln. And so I thought, I'll make a bibliography. So there's a bibliography, which is the last thing. So I cite everything, and I went to the architecture library and talked with the architecture librarian, and we looked through the Chicago Style Manual, and I made sure everything was right, or as right as it could be. The image in the middle of it is, the images sometimes come first, and sometimes they come second. The image in the middle of this piece is an image from a movie called The King of Marvin Gardens. The King of Marvin Gardens is a very odd film with Jack Nicholson and Bruce Dern as the main characters, and it's very, a lot of things I like are really sad, and a lot of things I usually say when I'm not in front of 100 people are really self-deprecating. But so there's the last scene in this film. There's this home movie, and it's the two. It's Bruce Dern and Jack Nicholson as little boys. And I was thinking about somebody talking about architecture and thinking about what might be something. It's like she's projecting her words onto some, describing some building, and this is an image projected onto architecture. And if you watch the movie, it's not exactly that dark in the image. I've sort of messed with it on Photoshop and lightened it up so you can see more of the architecture. And then I would watch the film in slow motion until I found something where I thought, oh, this is interesting. The two boys seem to be mirroring one another. So I went with that. And the image, it sounds like I'm talking about, or the language in the beginning is talking about the two boys. So it says, just the first sentence, it says, "It is a moment that most young architects face. They've built a few things, but the response is so low, they wonder if it's a fluke that they have gotten that far." And that's writing about the architect, I guess, as a young man, of Robert Venturi. And I was like, oh, well, it sounds like this will be absurd. It sounds like I'm talking about these two kids that are building a sandcastle, but with like really serious language about architecture. And other things are like, so I made this piece that was really important. It's a real game changer for me. And then I went home. This is more of a self-deprecating piece about things I could never achieve, including I never had a pair of cola-colored Clark's Wallabies, which were a pair of shoes that reminded me some of the things that I've never achieved are like making grass whistle and making my hand like your hands together and making a whistling sound. And for some reason, my wife was on in another studio, and I said, you know, I've just always associated the people that can do that as people that could wear cola-colored Clark's Wallabies, and so so I was like, what do you think of that? She's like, that sounds good, you know. So I cut the shoe out and put it there. These pieces are well, I also read a lot of poetry. I wasn't a big reader when I was younger. And my brother studied poetry, and he turned me on to poetry, and he gave me his collection. And so I became. It's short enough. The poems often are short enough that I can make my way through them. And it's funny. It's like this. I'm talking about a poet. It starts off, and it's another link. I'm talking about this movie by this. It's a film of a reading by James Wright, the American poet James Wright. And I thought, I'm watching this, and he's just reading his heart out. It's so beautiful, and nobody's doing anything. Like, nobody's clapping. And I was just like, this is brutal. You know, it's just so brutal. And it's pretty sad. Predominantly, the poems he's reading are quite sad. And so I'm always kind of looking for some sort of structural thread to kind of move through these pieces. So I read that this reading took place at a college called Morris College. And the only Morris I've ever known was my grandfather. And I didn't know his name was Morris. I thought his name was Maurice. Because he went by Maurice, and because when he was young, his mother said, don't call yourself Morris. Morris is not dignified, so call yourself Maurice. And so that's what he did. He called himself Maurice. And then I often try to, another thread is I'll try to find something that it's well, how am I going to connect James Wright, the poet, and my grandfather, and then something about myself. And I said 1976. I wonder what I was doing in 1976 when this reading took place. And I came up with this number. It's I was 7. And then I started finding these numbers, things adding up to 7. And I was like, you sort of go with the process, and this just kind of started helping me push along. And one of the interesting things about my grandfather or both my grandfathers, where they shaved their armpits. In fact, my mother claims that this is the only reason that the marriage held together. For as long as it did. I mean, long enough for my brother to be born and me to be born after him. Oh, okay, I'll wrap it up. So anyway, they shaved their armpits. And I say shave their armpits, and the other story is this crazy fantasy about tinnitus, and like, thank you. Thank you.